What if I told you that one of the most legendary and expensive watches ever created was once a complete failure? A watch nobody wanted, sitting unsold in display windows for years, ignored by collectors, overlooked by buyers, almost forgotten. And yet today, that same watch is one of the most desired timepieces on Earth, a symbol of racing, prestige, heritage, and obsession. But here's the twist. Rolex did not make it famous. Not marketing, not scarcity, not luxury. A Hollywood actor did. Stay with me, because this is the full story of the Rolex Daytona, and how Paul Newman accidentally turned a struggling watch into one of the greatest legends in watch history. To understand the Daytona, we need to go back to the early 1960s. At this point, Rolex was already dominating the professional watch world. The submariner had conquered the oceans. The explorer had climbed the highest peaks. The Datejust had become the standard for everyday luxury. Rolex was respected for precision, durability, and reliability. But there was one world left unconquered: speed. Motorsport in the 1960s was raw, dangerous, and glamorous. Drivers pushed machines to the limit with little safety. Precision timing was essential. Measuring lap times, calculating speed, and tracking performance were critical tools for racing drivers. Rolex saw this environment not just as a sport, but as a symbol of engineering excellence. And so, in 1963, Rolex introduced a new chronograph built specifically for racing, the Cosmograph Daytona. Named after the famous Daytona International Speedway in Florida, one of the most prestigious racing circuits in the world, the watch was engineered for performance. It featured a tachymeter bezel to measure speed over distance, chronograph pushers to time-lapse, a clean, readable dial for instant visibility under pressure. The watch was functional, purposeful, and built for professionals. On paper, it was perfect. But in reality, nobody cared. The early Daytona was not popular, sales were slow. Dealers struggled to sell them. Many Daytonas sat in display cases for years without buyers. Some retailers even discounted them heavily just to move inventory. Compared to the elegant Datejust or the rugged Submariner, the Daytona felt too technical, too niche, too specialized. It was a racing instrument in a world where very few people were actually racing. Ironically, one of the most iconic watches ever created began as a commercial failure. But then, everything changed. Paul Newman. Paul Newman was not just a Hollywood superstar. He was one of the biggest actors of his time, known for films like Cool Hand Luke and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. But beyond Hollywood, Newman had another passion: racing. Not casual driving, real racing, competitive racing. He trained seriously, competed professionally, and earned respect in the motorsport world. Racing was not a hobby. It was part of his identity. And during the late 1960s, his wife, Joanne Woodward, gave him a gift: a Rolex Daytona. But not just any Daytona. The watch Paul Newman received had a very unusual dial, and what collectors now call the exotic dial. It featured square markers, contrasting subdials, and an Art Deco-style font. At the time this dial was unpopular, dealers couldn't sell them, most buyers preferred the standard dial. The exotic dial looked strange, unconventional, different. But Paul Newman loved it. He wore the watch constantly, on racetracks, during interviews, in daily life, in photographs. The watch became part of his image. Over time, collectors began associating that unique dial with Paul Newman himself. And slowly, the nickname was born: the Paul Newman Daytona. But here's what makes the story fascinating. At first, this did not make the watch extremely valuable. For many years, Paul Newman Daytonas were simply interesting variations. Appreciated, yes, but not legendary. However, something powerful had begun. Because in the world of collecting, stories create value. And the Daytona now had a story: a failed watch, worn by a Hollywood racing driver. Then came the moment that changed everything forever. In 2017, Paul Newman's personal Rolex Daytona, the exact watch given to him by his wife, the very watch he wore for decades, was auctioned. The watch world froze. Collectors, investors, historians, everyone knew this was historic. But nobody expected the result. $17.8 million. A stainless steel Rolex Daytona became one of the most expensive watches ever sold in history. And in that moment, everything changed. The Daytona was no longer just a chronograph. It became a cultural icon, a symbol of heritage, scarcity, and legend. But the story of the Daytona is not only about Paul Newman, it is about evolution. The early Daytonas were manual wind watches, beautiful, mechanical, precise, but less convenient. Then in 1988, Rolex introduced a major transformation, the first automatic Daytona, powered by a modified Zenith El Primero movement. This changed everything. The watch became more practical, more modern, more desirable. Demand exploded, waiting lists began, scarcity increased. Then in the year 2000, Rolex introduced its own in-house chronograph movement, the caliber 4130. More reliable, more efficient, fewer components, greater power reserve, superior engineering. From that moment forward, the Daytona was not just iconic, it was technically elite. And demand only kept growing. Today, the Rolex Daytona is one of the most desired watches in the world. Stainless steel models sell above retail instantly. Waiting lists can stretch for years. Vintage models reach hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions. And the Paul Newman Daytona remains the ultimate grail for collectors. But why is the Daytona so powerful? Because it represents more than a watch. It represents racing, precision, heritage, scarcity, and above all, story. The story of a watch nobody wanted. The story of a man who simply wore what he loved. The story of how failure became legend. Rolex didn't plan this. Paul Newman didn't plan this. History happened naturally. Sometimes legends are not created in factories. They are created in life. And now the question is, if you had the chance to wear a Rolex Daytona, knowing its journey from failure to icon, knowing the legend behind it, would you?